As we discussed in Part 1, new evidence has emerged that journalists on the U.S. government payroll may have had an influence in the 2001 conviction of 5 Cuban intelligence officers known as the Cuban Five.
Journalists in Miami who presented themselves as being ostensibly independent were receiving cash from the U.S. government at the same time that they were publishing incendiary and hostile articles about Cuba and the Cuban Five. The U.S. government simultaneously paying journalists who did not disclose they were on the U.S. government payroll, and at the same time, that same U.S. government was prosecuting the Cuban Five in a Miami court in a very politically charged and high-profile prosecution.
Though little is known about the Cuban Five in the United States, ever since their arrest in 1998, it has been an issue front and center for much of the rest of the hemisphere. Father Miguel de Escoto of Nicaragua raised his concern about the case in an interview with The Real News last September, during his last day on the job as President of the United Nations General Assembly.
They infiltrated not government agencies, but terrorists who work out of Miami. Miami has been one of the biggest terrorist havens in the world.
Es una cosa increíble que sobre texto de una guerra contra el terrorismo a los más destacados de los héroes antiterroristas los castiguen.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson has been a vocal critic of the treatment that the Five have received under the U.S. legal system. The agents are known in Cuba as the Five Heroes. Colonel Wilkerson doesn't agree with that title.
Are they truly heroes? No, not in my mind. No more so than an American caught in a foreign country spying is a hero. He's doing his job. He's a professional doing his job. But I have a strange view of calling people heroes. We do it far too often in this country. But are they people who should be kept in jail for the time that they have been sentenced to? Absolutely not. That's not due process. That's not the American jurisprudence system. People spy on each other in this world all the time. Countries spy on other countries. We bugged the UN Security Council. We bugged the chambers of diplomats in the United Nations and listened to their conversations. Let's talk about the French spying on us for business purposes. Let's talk about the Israelis spying on us for every purpose under the sun. Let's talk about other people whom we spy on for the same reasons.
The Cuban government claims that this case is fundamentally different because the spies were not spying on the U.S. government, but rather on U.S.-based terrorists in Miami. One of the five, Gerardo Hernandez, who is serving 2 life sentences plus 15 years, described his mission to the BBC in a 2007 telephone interview from jail.
In 1997, a bomb exploded in a Cuban hotel and killed an Italian tourist. And in 1976, as you know, a bomb exploded in a Cuban airplane and killed 73 people. And that's only 2 examples of terrorist acts committed against Cuba. So at a certain point, Cuba decided to send some people to gather information on those groups. In 1998, Cuba passed to the FBI some information regarding those groups, hoping that the FBI would do something against them. And unfortunately, what they did was arresting the people that had gathered that information.
The law in both countries, as I read it, is the same. If you're operating as a foreign agent, you're guilty of operating as a foreign agent. It doesn't matter what your purpose is. It can be the most, you can want to bring Mother Teresa to southern Florida, but if you're a foreign agent, you're a foreign agent. But it doesn't call for 2 life sentences.
But Wilkerson does understand Cuba's desire to know what's happening in Miami.
There were Cubans in Florida who were intent on terrorism in Cuba. No question in my mind that's true. One of them walks free the streets of America today, principally in Miami and Dade County, and that's Luis Posada Carrilles, who was a CIA-trained operative who blew up a Cubana airliner and killed 70-plus people, who probably was responsible for killing an Italian in a series of hotel bombings in Havana. So we are harboring a terrorist in Florida today, a terrorist whom we will not extradite to Venezuela where he's under charge, and a terrorist whom we will not deal with ourselves because of our fear, our cowardly fear of the Cuban-American political minority in Florida. So I understand the Cubans' desire to come to Florida and to put people into these groups of essentially American terrorists and find out what they're planning and find out what they're doing. When I was in Cuba in March of 2007, one of the questions I got, which I thought was laughable, but I realized quickly was serious when the President of the National Assembly of Cuba asked me the question in all seriousness, when is the 82nd Airborne going to land on Jose Marti Airport? They really fear the United States, and they have ample reason to fear the United States. After all, in 1961, we tried to invade them at the Bay of Pigs, and we have tried to assassinate Fidel Castro a number of times. We have tried other operations against Cuba, so they have a reason to fear us. So let me tell you what I was doing in the early 90s with regard to military exercises. When we exercised, with the scenario being Fidel Castro has died, there's chaos in Cuba, what are you going to do? They're free flow exercises, so they go wherever the intelligence and the circumstances take you. And the exercise would always end not with us going to Cuba to insert some new government or whatever. It would end with us having blockaded the southern part of Florida, cordoned off the southern part of Florida, and turning back these flotilla of boats, these 600 or so boats that would have Cuban Americans in them with C4, dynamite, small arms, including machine guns and so forth, headed for Cuba in order to reestablish themselves on Cuba.
Wilkerson wants the Cuban Five's conviction to be reviewed immediately, especially given these new revelations about government-paid journalists.
And I think it's screamingly obvious that even without this, a change of venue should have been granted. How can you get a fair trial? One person put it this way, he said, it's like saying that an Israeli could get a fair trial in Tehran. That's a very apt analogy.
The convictions were overturned in appeal court in 2005 on the grounds that the trial should have never taken place in Miami. Attorney General at the time, Alberto Gonzalez, intervened, forcing another appeal, at which time the convictions were reinstated.
And all of this, of course, was about getting the 27 electoral votes in Florida for George W. Bush, and for that matter, for other presidents. What gave me a great deal of hope about a change in U.S. Cuba policy by the election of Barack Obama, for example, was that he was the first president elected without the Cuban American vote. And so I thought maybe we'll get some action here now, because obviously Cuban Americans are not necessary for his hold on the White House or his getting the 27 electoral votes from Florida.
In 2009, the Cuban Five lawyers pushed the trial right to the door of the Supreme Court, where Solicitor General Elena Kagan, acting on behalf of the Obama administration, filed an intervention calling on the Supreme Court to deny the review, which they did.
I've been somewhat dismayed by the lack of political courage on the part of the Obama administration, including the president himself, to take on some of these more dicey issues, and the reason is because they're scared of being labeled by the Rush Limbaughs of this world, who after all are the leaders of the Republican Party, my party, taking them to task for being light on national security.
Cuban-American singer Gloria Estefan, a vocal member of Miami's exile community whose father participated in the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, has enjoyed significant access to the president. He granted her a rare exclusive interview for her Christmas special with Univision. Estefan also recently organized a parade through Miami to demand freedom for political prisoners in Cuba. Posada Carriles, a self-admitted bomber of civilian targets inside Cuba, was in attendance at the parade. A couple weeks after the rally, Estefan played host to President Obama at a $15,000 per head cocktail party that raised more than $1 million for the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, Elena Kagan is now Obama's nominee to join the Supreme Court, and much has been made in the media about how little is known about her views. Colonel Wilkerson hopes that her position on the Cuban Five, along with other instances in which she privileged national security concerns over constitutional rights, becomes a focus of her confirmation hearings, which are set to begin on June 28.
I want to know on what grounds did she base her decision? This question should be asked, just as the question should be asked, how come you haven't closed Guantanamo? You promised to. How come you haven't done these other things? How come you are going, your Justice Department is going with the national security issue in courts of law all over the land, just the way the Bush administration was? How come the Patriot Act seems to mean as much to you, maybe more than it did to George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and David Addington? What is this about national security that seems to capture presidents and make them cowards?
This week, Gerardo Hernandez files his latest appeal for a retrial, waiting to see if revelations about government-paid journalists will be enough to force a revisiting of his conviction.